The wind didn't just blow across painted Butte Valley. It laid siege. It came down from the high ridges like a starved wolf, howling for a way in, scouring the frozen earth with a blade of ice. Snow fell not in flakes, but in horizontal sheets, a blinding white curtain that erased the lines between earth and sky, burying the scrub cedar and the hopeful fences of men. The world had been reduced to the shriek of the gale and the suffocating, endless white. Lost in that ocean of cold was the small cabin of Evelyn Pike. It clung to the sloping hillside, its pine logs dark against the snow, a solitary speck of warmth in a land gone dead. The drifts piled high, burying the split rail fence clear to the top bar and climbing the cabin walls like a frozen tide. Each gust hammered the wooden shingles and pushed icy drafts through the chinking. Inside, the fight was quieter but just as desperate. The stone fireplace, usually the cabin's roaring heart, had sunk to a bed of sullen orange embers. The heat they offered was a pale memory, barely pushing back the penetrating cold. Evelyn Pike stood near the hearth, rubbing her arms over her wool dress. She was a woman built of strong, lean lines, but the cold and the solitude had worn grooves of worry around her eyes and mouth. She looked at the small pile of wood stacked near the door, judging how long it might last. Maybe 2 days. If the storm held, 2 days wasn't nearly enough. In the corner, on the low cot built into the wall, her daughter breathed softly in sleep. Rosie was 6 years old, a small, still mound beneath a heavy buffalo hide and 2 patched quilts. Evelyn moved quietly, her stockinged feet making no sound on the rough plank floor. She pulled the top quilt higher, tucking it under the child's chin. Rosie stirred, her small hand tightening its grip on the ragged corn-husk doll she clutched even in sleep. The doll was missing an arm and most of its yarn hair, but Rosie loved it fiercely. Evelyn smoothed the fine, straw-colored hair back from the girl's forehead. The skin was warm. That was good. She let her hand rest there for a moment. A brief, silent prayer against the howling dark. She returned to the hearth, poking the embers with a piece of iron. A few sparks spun up the chimney, defiant. She was about to lay the last thick log onto the coals, the one she had been saving. When the sound came, it wasn't the wind. The wind was a steady, high-pitched scream. This was different. It was low, cutting through the bass notes of the storm. A groan, deep and guttural, that was almost human. It was followed by a sound that was not wood-breaking, but something heavier. A wet, solid crash, a dead weight falling. It came from the direction of the small, leaning barn, not 30 yards away, where her mule and 2 chickens huddled against the cold. Evelyn's entire body went rigid, every instinct, sharpened by 3 years alone in this unforgiving place, screamed at her. She didn't move. She just listened. The wind moaned, covering the world again. Had she imagined it? No. There it was again, weaker, a long, shuddering sigh. Her hand went to the heavy wooden bar leaning against the door frame. Her knuckles were white as she prepared to lift it and drop it into the iron brackets. Out here, a sound in a blizzard meant one of 2 things: a cougar or a wolf, driven down from the high country by hunger, or a man, driven mad by desperation. Neither was welcome. She thought of the mule. She thought of her daughter. Her first duty was to the bar. The bar was heavy in her hands. She thought of her late husband. Thomas, he had taught her to bar the door first and ask questions never. This land didn't forgive mistakes. But as she lifted it, Rosie sat up in the cot. The small movement caught Evelyn's eye. The girl's eyes were wide and fixed on the door, luminous in the dim firelight. "Mama." "Hush, Rosie. Go to sleep. It's just the wind." "No," the girl whispered. "There's someone out there." Evelyn froze. The bar held halfway to the brackets. "Mama, they'll die out there." Rosie's voice was simple. It wasn't a question. It was a fact, spoken with the absolute, uncomplicated certainty of a 6-year-old. It wasn't a plea. It was a judgment, and it struck Evelyn Pike harder than the wind. Her husband was dead, lost in a sudden freeze just north of Dry Willow, his horse having broken a leg. He had been found 2 days too late, a block of ice. He had died out there. She looked at the bar in her hands, then at her daughter's trusting, terrified face. The bar was safety. The bar was defense. The bar was common sense. And tonight, the bar felt like murder. She let it slide silently back against the wall. "Stay there," Evelyn commanded, her voice low and sharp. "Do not move from that bed. Do not make a sound. Do you understand me?" Rosie nodded, her eyes huge. Evelyn pulled on her heavy, fleece-lined boots, her fingers numb and clumsy with the laces. She grabbed Thomas's old canvas coat from the peg by the door. It was too broad in the shoulders and too long in the arms, smelling faintly of axle grease, cured tobacco, and a memory she couldn't afford to dwell on. She lit the storm lantern, the wick catching with a small puff of smoke. She took a deep breath, held it, and lifted the latch. The storm punched her. It stole the air from her lungs and plastered her hair to her face with stinging ice. The wind tore at the lantern in her hand, making the small yellow flame gutter wildly, fighting for its life. The light was pathetic. It pushed back the swirling darkness, maybe 5, 6 feet, turning the falling snow into a dizzying, hypnotic vortex of white specks. Beyond that small, chaotic circle of light, the world was gone. She pulled the door shut behind her, the thud already swallowed by the gale. "Hello," she shouted. Her voice was ripped from her mouth, a thin, useless sound. She lowered her head, the lantern held low, and leaned into the wind. She followed the weak memory of the path to the barn. The snow was deep, well past her knees, a heavy, wet cement that fought every single step. Ice crusted on her eyelashes, half blinding her. The barn was a looming shadow, then a solid wall. She checked the mule. It was fine, stomping and blowing nervously in its stall. The chickens were roosting, undisturbed. The sound had come from farther out, near the fence line. She pushed back out into the open. Sweeping the lantern, the wind howled, a physical force trying to push her back. And then she saw it. First, the horse, a dark shape, nearly buried, lying on its side. It was a good pinto. Its legs buckled beneath it, its head twisted at an angle that spoke of a broken neck. It must have stumbled in a drift, or slipped on the ice beneath. Its eye was open, frozen, staring at nothing. It was dead. And lying beside it, half sheltered by the animal's cooling body, was the man. He was face down in the snow, a dark mass of buckskin and wet hair. He was Apache. The realization hit Evelyn like a physical blow. His black hair was in 2 long braids, now frozen stiff and caked with ice. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. The stories from town, the bounties offered, the fear stoked at the general store in Dry Willow, all of it rose in her throat like bile. This was the enemy. This was the man Thomas had warned her about, the shadow on the ridge, the reason they kept the rifle loaded over the door. But he was dying. She stood for a long second, the lantern light shaking, the wind tearing at her coat. He didn't move. She took a step closer, then another. She knelt, the snow soaking instantly through the wool of her trousers. She set the lantern down, its light flickering on the scene. "Sir." No answer. She put her mittened hand on his shoulder. The buckskin was stiff as board, frozen solid. She grabbed him and pulled. It took 2 tries, her boots slipping in the deepening snow, her breath rasping. He rolled onto his back with a heavy, wet sigh. His face was copper, drawn tight over high cheekbones. His lips were a terrible shade of blue, cracked and bleeding. A thin crust of ice sealed his eyelids, but he was breathing. The smallest, shallowest puff of vapor left his mouth, instantly snatched by the wind. His coat had fallen open. She saw the dark, puckered scar high on his left shoulder, an old bullet wound, but the skin around it looked inflamed, angry. The buckskin shirt beneath stuck to it with half-frozen blood. He must have reopened it in the fall. His right hand was clenched at his chest, frozen into a fist. It was clutched so tightly that she had to pry his fingers open, the joints cracking with cold. To see what he held, it was a medallion of silver, heavy and dark with tarnish. hanging from a leather thong. Etched into its surface was a thunderbird, its wings spread wide over a deep canyon. It was the only thing on him that felt remotely warm, holding the last of his body's heat. "God help me," Evelyn whispered. The words were for her, not for him. She couldn't leave him. Rosie was right. He would die. Thomas had died out here. She couldn't walk back into that warm cabin, look her daughter in the eye, and know she had left a man to freeze to death. No matter who he was, she grabbed him under the arms. He was not a small man. He was solid, dense with muscle, and now a dead weight of ice and wet leather. She pulled. "Come on," she grunted, her teeth clenched. "You are not dying here, not tonight." She pulled him backward. One step. Her boots slipped. They both slid back. She regained her footing, bracing against the drift. She pulled again. Another step. The porch was 100 miles away. The light from her own window, visible now, was a distant, mocking star. She dragged him, her lungs burning with the razor-cold air, her back muscles screaming in protest. His heels carved 2 dark trails in the snow. She fell twice. The second time, she landed hard on her hip. The wind knocked out of her. She lay in the snow for a second, the man's head resting near her lap, the storm trying to bury them both. The temptation to just close her eyes, just for a minute, was overwhelming. Then she heard it, faint, carried on the wind. "Mama, Rosie." Evelyn scrambled up, a surge of adrenaline burning through her exhaustion. She grabbed the man's collar. She hauled him the last few feet, up the 2 steps of the porch, a dead, frozen log. She fumbled for the door handle, threw the door open, and dragged him over the threshold and onto the floor. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off the howl of the storm with a final, echoing thud. Silence. In the sudden, deafening quiet of the cabin, the only sounds were the crackle of the dying embers and the man's ragged, shallow breathing, a wet, rattling sound in his chest. The smell hit them immediately. It filled the small room, displacing the familiar scent of wood smoke and dried herbs. It was the raw, sharp smell of ice, of soaked leather, of horse sweat, of old blood, and the sour scent of a man pushed far past his limits. Rosie was standing by the cot, clutching her doll, her eyes impossibly wide. She looked from the man's still, frozen form, now melting into a puddle on her floor, to her mother's exhausted, snow-caked face. It was fear, but beneath it, a deep, trembling curiosity. Evelyn leaned against the door, her chest heaving, her vision swimming. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold anymore, but from the exertion and the sheer, terrible weight of what she had just done. She looked at the man. He was a problem she didn't know how to solve. Lying on her floor, she pushed herself off the door, her knees weak. She walked past him to the hearth. Her hands trembled as she picked up the last heavy log and placed it on the embers. She added kindling, blowing on the sparks until a small, hungry flame licked up the dry wood. She would deal with the man. But first, she needed fire. The man was a weight of ice and half-frozen leather on her floor. For a long moment, Evelyn simply stood, catching her breath, the fire she'd just built beginning to crackle and throw real heat into the room. Rosie had not moved from the cot, her small hand stuffed in her mouth, her eyes fixed on the still figure. "Rosie, bring me the water bucket and the small kettle," Evelyn said. Her voice was steady, cutting through the fear in the room. "And the rag bag from under my bed." The girl slid off the cot, giving the man a wide berth, and obeyed. Evelyn knelt beside him. Getting him out of the frozen buckskins was a battle. The leather was stiff as ironwood, and the fringes were frozen into solid clumps of ice. His coat had to be cut away, her shears struggling against the thick, soaked hide. His shirt beneath was finer, almost linen, but it was stuck fast to the wound on his shoulder with a dark, frozen slurry of blood and ice. She set the kettle on the hearth hook to warm. She worked with a grim, practical efficiency. This was not a man, not yet. He was a problem, like a frozen water pump or a sick mule. You dealt with what was in front of you. She finally got the heavy coat and shirt off him, leaving him bare from the waist up. She dragged him closer to the fire, turning him so the heat would hit his back. She took one of the rags and the lye soap she made herself, dipped it in the now steaming water, and began to clean the wound. It was an old wound, a bullet hole, puckered and angry. The fall from his horse had torn the half-healed skin open again. It was deep, and the flesh around it was an ugly purple, but it looked clean of rot, cauterized by the cold. As she worked, her rag moving in careful circles, her gaze traveled from the raw wound to the rest of him. His chest was a testament to a hard life. It was not the smooth, unblemished skin of the town merchants in Dry Willow. It was a landscape. A long, thin scar ran from his collarbone down toward his sternum, pale as moonlight. Another, crescent-shaped, tucked under his ribs. The mark of a knife. Smaller nicks and older. Faded lines littered his skin. It was, she thought, like a desert map. Each mark a dry riverbed, each line a canyon, telling the story of a life lived entirely on the unforgiving edge. He was built lean, but hard. Not an ounce of softness on him. As the warmth of the fire and the hot water seeped into him, his skin began to lose its deathly blue tint, returning to a deep, healthy copper. He stirred, a low groan vibrating in his chest. His eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused, milky with delirium. Evelyn paused, the rag in her hand. "You're safe," she said, her voice quiet. "You're in a cabin, out of the storm." His eyes tried to find her, rolling sightlessly. His lips cracked open. "Water," he rasped. She took a tin cup, dipped it in the fresh bucket, and lifted his head, carefully, putting the rim to his lips. He drank greedily, spilling half of it down his chin. He coughed, a harsh, racking sound that shook his whole frame and made him wince in pain. She settled him back down. He seemed to fall into a deeper, more natural sleep, his breathing evening out, the terrible rattle fading. Evelyn knew that sleep was good, but starvation was just as much an enemy as the cold. She went to the pantry box, took out a scoop of cornmeal, and put a pot on the fire to make a thin, watery mush. The smell of it, simple and warm, filled the cabin. It was the scent of survival. An hour later, she propped him up again. "You have to eat," she insisted. He was barely conscious, but some deep instinct responded. She spooned the warm mush into his mouth, a little at a time. It was slow, frustrating work. Most of it dribbled back out, but he swallowed some. He blinked, and for a second, his eyes seemed to clear. He looked at the spoon, then at her face. His voice was a dry scrape, so low she had to lean in to hear it. "Best meal I've had," he whispered, his breath smelling of corn. "Since my wife passed." The words hung in the air, simple, devastating. They landed in Evelyn's chest with a dull ache. This shadow, this dangerous stranger, was a man who had known her own brand of loss. The thought was unwelcome, complicating. He said nothing more. His eyes slipped closed, and he was asleep, his head heavy against her arm as she held him. She gently laid him back down, pulling one of her own quilts over him. He was no longer a problem. He was a person. Evelyn spent the rest of the night in the rocking chair, the loaded rifle across her lap, watching him. She did not sleep. She watched the fire, and she watched the man, and she listened to the storm slowly, finally, wear itself out. By morning, the wind had died to a low moan, and a weak, gray light filtered through the snow-caked window. The silence was heavy, thick. He woke with the light. He didn't startle. His eyes just opened. They were a strange color, a pale, clear gray, like river stones underwater. They were wary, assessing, and utterly direct. He looked at the log ceiling, at the rifle in her lap, at Rosie peeking from the cot, and then at her. His gaze held hers. It did not waver. "Where?" he asked, his voice still ruined. "Am I?" "Painted Butte," Evelyn answered, her voice flat. "My cabin. You were freezing to death by my fence line." He processed this slowly. He tried to sit up, but a sharp intake of breath and a spasm of pain from his shoulders stopped him. He fell back, his eyes closing for a moment. "Talon," he said, opening them again. "My name is Talon Dosela." Evelyn nodded, though the name meant nothing to her. "Evelyn Pike. That's my daughter. Rosie." Rosie, seeing he was awake and not a monster, slipped off the cot. She crept closer to the hearth, keeping her distance, and sat on the floor. Picking up a charred stick from the kindling box, she began to draw lazy circles in the gray ash, watching the man. She held her doll up for him to see. "This is May," Rosie announced, her voice small but clear. "I call her May, for luck." A flicker of something not quite a smile, but a softening touched the man's tired eyes. He gave a short, stiff nod. "A good name." He stayed on the pallet by the fire all morning. He did not ask for anything, but he accepted the water she offered and ate 2 full bowls of the cornmeal mush, this time with a steadiness that showed his strength was returning. He was quiet, a still, watchful presence in the small cabin. By noon, the sun had broken through the clouds, and the world outside was a blinding, brilliant white. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the drip, drip, drip of melting ice from the eaves. Talon pushed himself into a sitting position, his back against the fireplace stones. He moved stiffly, his face tight with pain, but he did not complain. "Ma'am," he said, his voice stronger, "I need to work." Evelyn, who was kneading dough for bread, stopped, her hands white with flour. "You're in no condition to work. You need to rest. I ate your food. I took your fire," he said. It was not an argument. It was a statement of fact. His pale gray eyes moved from her to the window, and then up to the ceiling. He was listening to the drip. "Your barn roof. I heard the wind tearing at it last night. No roof should bow to the wind." Evelyn was about to argue, to tell him it was her concern, not his, but she looked at the set of his jaw. This was not a request. It was his code. To accept her charity without repaying it was, to him, a kind of death. "The ladder is by the woodshed," she said quietly. "And I have a box of new shingles, but the roof is slick." "I've walked on worse," he said. He stood, slowly, using the fireplace for support. He found his frozen coat, which Evelyn had hung by the door. It was still stiff. He put it on, hissing as he pulled it over his injured shoulder. He walked out the door, his steps unsteady but determined. Evelyn watched him for a moment, then sighed, wiping the flour from her hands. She pulled on her own coat and boots and followed him. She found him at the side of the small barn, staring up at the roof. A section of shingles near the peak had been ripped away by the storm, leaving a dark, wet patch of wood. He was already fitting the ladder against the wall. "I'll hold it," Evelyn said, moving to the base. He looked down at her, surprised. He seemed about to object, but he saw the same stubborn set to her jaw that she had seen in his. He just nodded. He slung the hammer she'd brought him from a loop on his belt. He filled a leather pouch with nails, grabbed a bundle of the new shingles, and began to climb. He moved with a careful, deliberate grace, testing each rung before putting his full weight on it. Even injured, he was balanced. For the next 2 hours, they worked in a strange, silent partnership. She stood at the base of the ladder, her boots sinking into the melting snow, her hands gripping the wooden rungs, holding it steady against the wall. He worked above her. The sound of his hammer was the only break in the vast, snowy silence. It was a good sound. Tap, tap, thwack, tap, tap, thwack. It was steady. Sure, each blow was precise. He was not a man who wasted motion. He measured twice, cut once. Evelyn found herself watching his hands. They were calloused, strong, and surprisingly careful as he set the shingles, his fingers aligning the edges perfectly before he drove the nail home. His breath was visible in the cold air, a steady plume, matching the rhythm of the hammer. When he was finished, he climbed down slowly. He stood on the ground, looking up at the neat, solid patch of gray against the weathered brown of the old roof. He nodded once, satisfied. "It will hold," he said. "Thank you," Evelyn said. They walked back to the cabin, the snow crunching under their boots. As dusk fell, the clouds rolled back in, threatening another. Lighter snow. The brief thaw was over. The cold settled back in. Evelyn stirred the pot of beans she'd had simmering on the fire all day. She added the last of her salt pork. The smell was rich and smoky. They ate sitting on the floor by the fire, Rosie between them, the tin plates hot on their laps. It was a silent meal, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Talon ate slowly, as if tasting every bean. Rosie, her earlier fear completely gone, chattered to her doll. May, the man, Talon, just listened, his presence a solid, warm thing in the small room, as real as the heat from the hearth. After she had finished her food, Rosie's head began to nod. She leaned sideways, her small body relaxing, and her head came to rest on Talon's thigh. Evelyn tensed, ready to move her, but Talon didn't flinch. He didn't look down. He just stopped eating for a second, his hand resting on his knee. Then, very slowly, he laid his hand on the girl's back, a light, protective weight. Rosie sighed in her sleep. Evelyn looked at the rough, scarred hand of the Apache warrior, resting gently on her daughter's back. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She finished her beans, the quiet broken only by the fire's crackle and the sleeping girl's breathing. After a while, Evelyn spoke, her voice low. "The storm's coming back, but it won't be as bad. The south trail should be clear by tomorrow, maybe the day after. You can leave when it clears." Talon stared into the fire. He did not look at her. He watched the flames eat the wood. He seemed to be weighing her words. "I could," he said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at Rosie, asleep on his lap, and then his pale gray eyes lifted to meet Evelyn's. "But it wouldn't be right." The words were simple. There was no flourish to them. They were like the nails he had driven into the roof, few, essential, and driven deep. They hit the pine log of the cabin wall and stuck, vibrating in the warm air, silencing her protests before they were even formed. It was the beginning of a strange, new peace. The cabin, which had been her fortress of solitude, suddenly felt different. It felt, for the first time in 3 years, like it was not empty. 2 days passed. The strange, fragile peace held the cabin in a tight grip. The world outside was a dazzling, blinding white, the sun reflecting off the deep snow with a painful intensity. The roof, the patch that Talon had fixed, was holding fast, the sound of melting water, a steady drip, drip, drip from the eaves, was the cabin's new clock. Talon's strength returned in quiet, steady increments. He was no longer a guest. He had become a presence. He said little, but he did. He split the wood Evelyn had thought would be too green to burn, his axe blows as sure and rhythmic as his hammering. He rehung the cabin door, which had sagged on its leather hinges, so it no longer let in the draft. He taught Rosie how to carve a small, simple bird from a piece of kindling, his large, scarred hands moving with surprising delicacy as he guided her small ones on the wood. Evelyn watched him. She found herself watching him constantly. She watched him as he ate the food she cooked, with that same slow, reverent pace. She watched him as he sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, his face impassive in the flickering light. He was a puzzle she could not solve. The fear she had felt in the storm had been replaced by a deep, unsettling curiosity. He was gentle, he was quiet, and yet there was a hardness in him, a core of something that had seen too much. On the third morning, the sun held a real warmth. The snow had melted back from the south-facing wall of the cabin. Evelyn, feeling a surge of domestic energy, a desire to reclaim her space, decided it was time to truly clean. She was tired of the lingering smell of wet leather and old blood. She sent Rosie outside to the porch to play with her bird carving in the weak sun. Talon was out by the woodshed, the sound of his axe-splitting oak ringing clear in the cold air. The cabin was hers again. She pulled the cot and the table away from the walls. She took her broom, made of bound birch twigs, and began to attack the floor. sweeping the accumulated dust, ash and dirt toward the open hearth. She swept around the woodpile, a messy stack of logs and bark near the fireplace where Talon had slept. Her broom hit something that wasn't wood. It was soft, but heavy. A dull thud. She bent down, pushing aside a few pieces of bark. Tucked deep in the shadows between the woodpile and the stone of the hearth was a small pouch of oiled deerskin. It was not hers. She pulled it out. It was heavy, far heavier than it looked, and cinched tight with a leather thong. She knew, instantly, it was his. These were the only possessions he had brought into her house. Besides the clothes he wore and the knife on his belt, he must have hidden it there while she slept that first night. She shouldn't. She knew she shouldn't. It was his. It was private. But her cabin had been invaded. Her life had been cracked open by this man. She had a right to know who, exactly, she was sheltering. Her fingers, dusty from the floor, fumbled with the knot. The thong unlaced, and she loosened the neck of the bag. She turned it over into her hand. 3 heavy silver dollars, minted in Mexico, fell into her palm, their weight cool and solid. There was a small, bone-handled folding knife, its blade honed to a razor's edge. And last, the thing she recognized from the storm, the thing he had clutched as if it were his soul, the silver medallion. She picked it up. It was heavy, beautifully made. The Thunderbird was carved in deep, stark lines, its wings spread over a canyon. It was not the crude work of a frontier smith. This was the work of a master. It was valuable. This, combined with the silver dollars, was more money than she had seen in one place in over a year. "I was sweeping." Her voice was sharp, defensive. She hadn't heard him enter. The sound of the axe had stopped, but his moccasins, which she had dried for him, were silent on the plank floor. He was standing right behind her. She spun around, her heart jumping into her throat. The silver pieces were still in her hand. She felt a hot flush of shame. She had been caught. Talon did not look angry. His face was unreadable, but his pale gray eyes were fixed on the silver in her hand. He looked, she thought, almost sad. He stepped forward, not quickly, but with a deliberate smoothness that was almost unnerving. He held out his hand, but he did not reach for the money. He reached for the medallion. His calloused fingers closed gently around the silver Thunderbird, his thumb brushing over the carving as if to wipe her touch from it. He did not snatch it. He simply reclaimed it. He looked at her, his gaze steady, and there was a question in it. But beneath that, there was a profound weariness, a carefulness, as if he was afraid that one wrong word would shatter the quiet peace they had built. "I found it by the wood," she said, her voice softer now, but still strained. "I didn't mean to. It is all I have," he said, his voice a low rumble. He carefully placed the medallion back into the pouch, then the knife, then the silver dollars. He pulled the thong tight. The silence in the room stretched. He had his secrets back, but now the fact that there were secrets was a tangible thing, a new wall between them. He held the pouch in his hand, not hiding it. He seemed to be deciding something. "It was a gift," he said finally, his gaze lifting from the pouch to her face. "From my father, Chief Chayton Dosela." The name meant nothing, just a name. But she must have frowned, because he clarified, "Of the Dosela trading and stock at Salt River Draw." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. It was as if the floor had dropped out from under her. She instinctively took a step back, her hand finding the rough-hewn mantel of the fireplace to steady herself. "Dosela?" She knew that name. Everyone from Arizona to the New Mexico territories knew that name. It was not the name of a wandering, half-frozen savage. It was the name of a dynasty. She remembered the talk in Whitcomb's general store, the hushed, jealous, fearful whispers of the ranchers and merchants in Dry Willow. The Doselas, an Apache family that had somehow turned the white man's game against him and won. They didn't just trade. They owned silver mines. They ran thousands of head of horse, selling them to the cavalry at prices that made settlers choke. They owned water rights. They owned freight lines. The rumors were wild. Some said old Chayton Dosela was richer than the Mesa Mutual Bank, that he kept his gold buried in the canyons. Others, the jealous ones, whispered that the Doselas were traitors, that they had sold their own people for government contracts and silver, and that their wealth was built on a foundation of compromise and blood. They were feared, they were hated, and they were, without question, the most powerful native family in the territory. And this man, this Talon, was one of them. He was not a beggar. He was royalty, a millionaire, a cold knot of suspicion, dark and ugly, tightened in Evelyn's stomach. All her husband's warnings, all the prejudice she had heard her whole life, all the fear of the man on the ridge, it all came rushing back. Thomas had died out on the frontier, lost in a freeze while checking trap lines. But it was a frontier made dangerous by men like him, by the endless, simmering conflict. She looked at him, and for the first time, she did not see the man who had fixed her roof. She saw the silver, the knife, the power, the other. "What are you doing here?" she asked, and her voice was cold, sharp. "A Dosela, freezing to death by my fence. It doesn't make sense." He saw the change in her. He saw the trust she had offered him curdle into the same suspicion he had seen his entire life. His shoulders slumped, just slightly. He put the leather pouch inside his shirt, against his skin. "I left that name," he said quietly. "You left it?" "A name," he said, turning to look into the fire. "Can be a heavy thing to carry. Too heavy for a long road. That name. It carries feuds that started before I was born. It carries the greed of other men and the hate. It owns silver, and it owns land, and it owns arguments. It does not own me." He spoke simply, but the weight of his words filled the cabin. He had walked away. From all of it. From the wealth, the power, the hate. Evelyn's mind reeled. She tried to reconcile the two images, the powerful, wealthy scion of the Dosela clan, and the exhausted man who had spoken of his dead wife, who had shown such gentleness to her daughter. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Who are you now?" He was silent for a long time. He looked down at his own hands, the calloused, scarred map of his life. "A man," he said, his voice low. "Just a man, learning how to be decent." The answer was so simple, so raw, it disarmed her. The knot of suspicion in her stomach did not disappear, but it loosened. She looked at him, really looked at him, past the name and the rumors, to the man standing by her fire. She saw the old wound on his shoulder, the weariness in his eyes, the steadiness in his hands. She saw the profound, aching honesty in his gaze. She wanted to believe him. She did not know if she could. The world she knew, the world of Dry Willow, had taught her that trust was a fool's game, and that his kind and her kind were meant to be enemies. But the man in her cabin had shown her nothing but quiet strength and a deep, unspoken respect. Evelyn didn't say anything. She didn't promise him belief. She couldn't, but she also could not bring herself to look away from those clear, gray eyes. She broke the gaze first, turning back to her broom. "The floor still needs sweeping," she said, her voice tight. She began to sweep again, the rhythmic shush of the birch twigs the only sound. He did not move. He just stood by the fire, a solid, unmovable presence in her home, the weight of his unspoken past settling around them. That night, the wind returned. It was not the blizzard from before, but a low, mournful wind that rattled the window frame and pushed at the cabin walls. Evelyn and Talon sat at the small table, Rosie already asleep on her cot. The air between them was thick with everything they had not said. The wind hit the north wall with a sudden, violent gust. It moaned, searching for a way in. Evelyn tensed, her old anxieties rising. But the roof was silent. The patch held. The new shingles, nailed down by his steady hand, did not rattle. The cabin, which had always felt so fragile, suddenly felt solid. The roof did not bow, and under that new, strong roof, the two of them sat in the quiet, guarding the fragile, dangerous silence that held them. The thaw came, and with it, the world. For nearly a week, the small cabin had been an island in a sea of white, but the warm Chinook wind, The one Talon had taught Rosie to call the Snow Eater had done its work. The drifts shrank. The ground reappeared in wet, muddy patches, and the trail to Dry Willow, while treacherous, was once again passable. With the open trail came Ezra Mott. Mott was a man who moved with the weather, a fur trader and peddler who lived in his wagon, following the seasons and the scent of opportunity. He was a greasy, talkative man with small, quick eyes that missed nothing and valued everything. He arrived in a cloud of mule breath and the jangle of pots and pans tied to the side of his wagon. Evelyn had been dreading this. She needed coffee. She needed salt. She had been putting off the trip to town, and Mott's arrival was both a reprieve and a new danger. Talon was by the barn, mending the harness leather Evelyn had neglected. He did not hide. He simply stood and watched as Mott's wagon squeaked to a halt. "Mistress Pike," Mott bellowed, tipping a hat that was stiff with grime. "A hard winter, and it ain't even half done, but it looks like you fared better than most. Kept warm. I see." His eyes darted from Evelyn on the porch to the tall, silent figure by the barn. The man's buckskins were clean now, his black hair braided. He stood with a stillness that was more intimidating than any threat. Mott's smile faltered, his gaze flickering. He was a man who knew things. He knew faces. He knew marks. He knew power. His eyes narrowed, catching the dull gleam of silver at Talon's throat. The Thunderbird. Mott's oily grin returned, but it was different now. It was knowing. "Well," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial leer. "I see you found yourself some company." Evelyn's spine stiffened. "Mr. Mott, I need coffee beans and salt." "Coffee, is it?" Mott said, turning to his wagon but not looking at his wares. He was looking at Talon. "And here I was thinking you were out of everything. Seems you've had a guest, a very distinguished guest." He turned back to Evelyn, his voice slick. "Business must be good for some. Tell me, ma'am, how is it hosting the Apache Prince?" The name, spoken aloud in the clear, cold air, was a slap. Evelyn felt the color drain from her face. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice thin. "Oh, I think you do." Mott cackled. He licked his lips, his eyes calculating. "That's Docella Silver, or I'm a blind man. Heard tell old Chayton's boy went walking. Never figured he'd walk here. You've got a millionaire mending your harness. Widow. You ought to be charging him more for his board." He laughed. A wet, ugly sound. Talon took one step forward, his hand moving not to his knife, but just resting on his belt. The movement was slight, but it stopped Mott's laugh cold. "She needs coffee," Talon said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air and hit Mott like a stone. "And salt." Mott's smile vanished. He nodded. Suddenly, all business. "Yes, sir, right away." The transaction was swift. Evelyn paid with 2 of her precious eggs and a small coin. Mott didn't try to haggle. He didn't speak again. He loaded his mule, tipped his hat to Evelyn, pointedly ignoring Talon, and drove his wagon away, the wheels sucking at the mud. Evelyn watched him go, her stomach a cold knot of dread. He was heading straight for Dry Willow. The news hit the town like a lit stick of dynamite tossed into a barrel of gunpowder. Ezra Mott, feeling brave again once he was a mile down the road, rolled into the dusty Spur saloon and bought a round. "You will not believe," he announced, "what the Widow Pike is keeping warm in her bed." By sundown, the story was in every corner. At Whitcomb's general store, men leaned on the counter, spitting tobacco juice into the stove, their voices low. Docella. You're sure?" Mott swore it. Saw the silver on him. "That woman's lost her mind, endangering her own child." By Sunday, the whispers had even reached the small white church. Pastor Davies spoke of the snares of the flesh and the dangers of inviting the heathen into our homes, his eyes resting for just a moment too long on the empty pew where Evelyn Pike sometimes sat. The news eventually found its way to the 2 men who, in their own ways, ran the valley. Sheriff Boone Crowder heard it while oiling his rifle in his office. Crowder was a heavy man, thick in the gut and the jowls, who believed in one thing: order. His order. He didn't care much for right or wrong, but he hated anything that stirred the pot. A docela Apache living with a white widow was stirring the pot. It was messy, it was improper, and it gave the restless cowboys in town, the ones just waiting for an excuse to start trouble, a focus for their winter boredom. Crowder sighed, laying the rifle down. He'd have to ride out there. Not yet, but soon. The other man was Silas Quince. Quince was a rancher, but he didn't run cattle. He ran land. He bought it, he fenced it, he choked off water, and he waited. He was a patient man with a deep, abiding greed. He was sitting in his leather chair, a map spread on his desk, when his foreman told him the news. Quince did not smile. He simply picked up a pencil and tapped the map. On a small, insignificant-looking plot marked Pike. T. "Is that the one?" he asked. "Yes, sir." The foreman said, "The one with the spring. The one that never freezes. A spring that never freezes." Quince mused. That small spring, bubbling up on the north edge of the Pike homestead, was worth more than the whole rocky acreage. If he could get that land, he could water 1,000 head of cattle on the dry pasture to the north, land he'd bought for pennies. He'd been waiting for the widow to fail, to be starved out or scared off so he could buy her out cheap. Now, she had given him a different tool. "A woman alone is a sad thing," Quince said, leaning back. "A woman who consorts with savages. Well, that's a moral problem, and folks in this valley like to solve moral problems." He saw his path, clear as day. He could press her, use the town's outrage to force a sale. Evelyn knew none of this, but she felt it. She felt the silence. The valley, which had been lonely, was now hostile. 3 days after Mott's visit, she ran out of flour. Rosie couldn't live on beans and salt pork. She had to go to town. Talon saw her hitching the mule to the small cart. "I will go," he said, his hand on the harness. "No." Her voice was flat. "You can't. You saw Mott. They know." "Then I will walk beside you." "No," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "They will see that as a provocation or a weakness on my part. I have to do this. This is my town. This is my land." He looked at her, his pale gray eyes reading the fear and the stubborn pride in her face. He stepped back. "Your rifle is clean. I oiled it. Take it." She nodded. She laid the rifle on the seat of the cart, climbed up, and snapped the reins. The mule lurched forward. The trip to Dry Willow was the longest 4 miles of her life. The town was quiet, too quiet. As she drove down the muddy main street, she saw faces in the windows. A curtain would twitch. A man standing on the boardwalk of the saloon would stop talking, turn, and just stare. The stares were not just curious. They were hard. They were like small, sharp stones. She pulled up in front of Whitcomb's. She took a deep breath, set her jaw, and held her chin high. She would not be broken by this. She slid off the cart, leaving the rifle where it was. She pushed open the door. The small bell above it rang, announcing her. The store, usually busy on a supply day, fell silent. 3 ranchers by the stove stopped talking. Mr. Whitcomb, polishing the glass on his candy jar, stopped polishing. His wife, who was weighing beans, let the scoop fall. Evelyn walked to the counter. She could feel the eyes on her back, burning holes through her wool coat. She could smell the stale tobacco, the sour whiskey, the unwashed bodies. "Mr. Whitcomb," she said, her voice clear and loud in the silence. "I need a 20-pound sack of flour and a pound of salt." Whitcomb looked at her. His face was pinched. He had known her husband. He had given her credit when Thomas died. Now, he looked at her like she was a stranger, like she was something unclean. "That'll be $2, he said, his voice cold. He did not move. "I'm paying with coin," she said, pulling the money from her pocket. She placed the silver dollars on the counter. Her hand did not shake. He took the money, his fingers snatching it, as if her touch might stain him. He jerked his head at his son, who silently hoisted a sack of flour, grabbed a bag of salt, and walked out the door with them. He did not offer to help her. He did not ask about Rosie. He did not say God bless as he usually did. Evelyn stood there for a moment, the stares of the men like a physical weight. She turned, her head high, and walked out of the store. The bell rang. As the door closed, the sudden burst of loud, angry talking was like a gunshot. She loaded the cart, untied the mule, and drove out of town, never once looking back. She did not cry. She held the anger and the humiliation inside, a hot, tight ball in her chest. She was shaking by the time she got back to the cabin. Rosie ran out to meet her, but stopped when she saw her mother's face. Talon was waiting on the porch. He took the reins from her trembling hands as she stepped down. He looked at her white, strained face. He said nothing, just began to unhitch the mule. Evelyn stalked into the cabin, threw her coat on the peg, and began to put the flour away. He followed her in, carrying the salt. He set it on the table. "You have to go," she said, her back to him. He was still. "You heard Mott," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. "You saw them in town." She spun to face him. "This isn't your home. This isn't your fight. They hate me because of you. They'll use you to take this land. They'll hang you, Talon, and they'll smile while they do it. I know the men in that town," he said. His voice was calm, a low stone in the middle of her raging river. "Then you know I'm right. You have to leave. Tonight, when it's dark." "And where will you go?" he asked. "But I'm not going anywhere. This is my land. This is my home." "Yes," he said. "It is." He took a step closer. "You took me in. You fed me. You bound my shoulder. I fixed your roof. The debt is paid." "Then go," she cried. "The debt is paid," he repeated, his voice still quiet. "But the account is not settled. You are in trouble. This trouble came to your door because I was here." He looked at her, his pale eyes searching her face. "Trouble needs a place to stand, too. If I leave, it will not go with me. It will stay here, with you. It will have this whole cabin to itself." He shook his head. A slow, final movement. "I am not leaving." Evelyn stared at him, her anger collapsing into a sudden, terrible vulnerability. He was right. They would not forget. Leaving wouldn't save her. It would only leave her alone. She sank onto the small stool by the table, her hands covering her face. She did not weep, but a long, shuddering sigh escaped her. She felt him move, but she didn't look up. Rosie, sensing the shift, ran in. She looked at her mother's bowed head and at Talon's still figure. She did what a child does. She built a bridge. She slipped her small hand into Evelyn's, pulling it from her face. Then she grabbed Talon's large, calloused hand. She pulled them, one in each of her own, linking them, forcing them together. "It's time to name the wind," Rosie declared, as if it were the most important ritual in the world. "The wind is blowing from the south. That's the kind wind." "Right, Talon, the one that brings good things." Talon looked down at the small girl, then at Evelyn. He did not let go of Rosie's hand. "Yes," he said, his voice soft. "It brings kindness. The north wind, that one brings memories." Evelyn's fingers, cold and stiff, slowly, tentatively, curled around his. It was the first time they had touched, truly touched, skin to skin. Since she had cleaned his wound, his hand was warm, solid, and impossibly strong. That night, they sat outside on the porch, wrapped in quilts. Talon, at Rosie's urging, pointed to the sky. He taught her the names of the stars, not the names from Evelyn's books, but his names. The 7 hunters, the woman who carries the basket, the coyote's trail, which was the river of stars flowing across the black. They were a small, fragile boat of 3, rowing against a dark tide. The tide, it turned out, was closer than they knew. Later that night, long after Rosie was asleep, Evelyn was woken by a hand on her shoulder. She sat up, her heart pounding. Talon was standing by her cot, a shadow against the dim moonlight. He put a finger to his lips. Outside. She heard it then, the scrape of a boot on rock, a low, muttered curse. They moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. At the far edge of her property, down by the creek where the spring was, they saw them. 2 lanterns, moving like fireflies. Men on horseback. They were hammering something into the ground. Quince's men. They watched for an hour. In the cold, silent cabin, the men worked quickly, driving stakes, moving the line of her property 50 yards to the west, just enough to put the spring squarely on the other side. Then they mounted up and rode away. When the sun rose, Evelyn was already dressed. Her face was pale, set in lines of cold, hard fury. She walked to the woodshed and picked up Thomas's old hatchet. Talon fell into step beside her, his knife at his belt. They walked together, not speaking, down to the spring. The new stakes were crude, pine, with their tops painted a garish red. They formed a neat, insulting line in the mud. Evelyn walked to the first stake. She did not hesitate. She swung the hatchet, burying it in the wood. She levered it back, breaking the stake off at the ground. She moved to the next one, and the next. Talon stood watch, his eyes scanning the ridges. When she reached the final stake, the one closest to the spring, she pulled it from the earth with her bare hands. She threw it on the pile of broken wood. She was not done. She looked around, her eyes landing on 2 fallen, sturdy oak branches. She dragged them to the spot. Using the rope Talon handed her from his belt, she lashed them together, her knuckles white, into a simple, rough cross. She lifted it. With all her strength, she jammed the sharpened end deep into the soft earth, right where the stake had been. She stepped back, her breath ragged. The cross stood, stark and defiant, against the morning sky. "This land is guarded," she whispered. The narrow, dangerous water between what was right and what was safe had vanished. They were in the middle of the storm now, together. The cross at the spring was a declaration, and the valley heard it. The fragile peace was not only broken, it was shattered. The act of defiance solidified the battle lines. Quince's men rode by the cabin now, not stopping, but slowing their horses, their stares lingering on the house, on the barn, on the lone woman who dared to stand against them. The tension was a tangible thing, a metallic taste in the air. Evelyn found herself holding her breath. Talon worked, his face a mask of stone, chopping wood with a furious, controlled energy, his eyes constantly scanning the ridge. They spoke little, their words reserved for necessities. The small cabin felt like it was holding a lit fuse. And then, the fuse was drowned. The weather turned with a vicious, unseasonable spite. The Chinook wind vanished, replaced by a cold, driving rain from the north. It was not the snow of winter or the gentle rain of spring. It was a deluge, a cold, gray sheet of water that fell for 2 days without pause. The thaw had already softened the earth, and the rain turned the entire painted butte valley into a bog. The dry trails became rivers of thick, grasping mud. The creek by the spring, already high, became a roaring, brown torrent that shook the ground. The cabin was once again an island, but this time an island of mud, cold and damp. The chills seeped through the chinking. On the evening of the second day, Rosie coughed. It was a small, dry sound. Evelyn, mending a sock by the firelight, looked over. "Cover your mouth. Sweet," she said, her voice distracted. An hour later, the cough came again, but this time it was different. It was a tight, barking sound, like a small dog, Rosie, who had been playing with her carved bird, suddenly went still. "Mama," she whimpered, "I'm cold." Evelyn put down the sock, her heart giving a single, hard thump. She crossed the room and laid her hand on Rosie's forehead. It was burning. The fever had come on like a predator, swift and silent. "Into bed. Rosie, right now." By midnight, the cabin was a place of terror. Rosie was no longer just coughing, she was fighting for air. Her small chest heaved, and each breath was a high, thin, whistling sound, a terrible rasp that cut through the sound of the rain lashing the roof. Her eyes, which Evelyn had always known as clear and bright, were glazed, unfocused, rolling back in her head. She was delirious, muttering about the wind and the stars Talon had taught her. Evelyn was frantic. She tore through her small medicine box, her hands shaking. There was nothing. The last of the willow bark tea was gone. The small brown bottle of laudanum was empty. She had nothing to fight the inflammation, nothing to break the fever that was stealing her daughter. Quinine, Evelyn whispered, her voice choking. She needs quinine. Talon, who had been standing by the hearth, a silent, watchful shadow, looked at her. The blue saguaro, Evelyn said, looking at him, her eyes wide with a desperate, animal fear. Old Man Hemlock's trading post. It's 10 miles. South. She didn't need to say the rest. 10 miles. 10 miles of sucking mud, flooded creeks, and a rain so cold it felt like ice. A journey that was impossible. She won't last the night. Talon, her breath. God, listen to it. She's... Evelyn's voice broke. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking, before her sob had even faded. Talon was moving. He grabbed his wet buckskin coat from the peg. He shoved his knife into his belt. He was checking the oilcloth wrap on the rifle she had taken to town. The horse, he said. His voice was not a question. It was a command. Old Bess. Evelyn looked up, her face streaked with tears. She's not a saddle horse. Talon, she's a plow horse. She's old. She's strong, he said. And she's all we have. He was out the door before Evelyn could say another word. She ran to the window, wiping the condensation from the glass. She saw him in the driving rain, a dark shape moving toward the barn. The light from his lantern was a small, defiant spark in the suffocating wet darkness. She heard him. His voice was a low, calm rumble, talking to the horse, soothing it as he led it from the barn. The horse whinnied, a high, nervous sound, terrified of the storm. The cabin door opened, blasting the room with cold, wet air. Talon stood on the threshold, rain streaming from his hair and the brim of a hat Evelyn hadn't known he possessed Thomas's old, ruined felt. Keep the fire high, he said. Boil water. She will need it. Talon, she whispered. You can't. The bridge at Split Rock Creek. It will be underwater. Then I will go around, he said. You'll die out there. He looked at her, his pale gray eyes cutting through the dimness. No, he said. I will not. He turned and was gone. The door slammed shut, and the only sound was the howling rain and the whistling, ragged breath of her dying child. The night became a living thing, a monster. The trail was not a trail. It was a churning river of cold, black mud, a greedy trap that sucked at the horse's hooves with every step. Talon did not ride. He walked, leading the heavy plow horse, his own feet sinking calf-deep into the mire. The rain was a physical assault, driven by a wind that moaned and shrieked, tearing at his coat. He came to Split Rock Creek. He had not needed to see it. He had heard it, a quarter-mile away. It was a deafening roar, the sound of 1,000 angry voices. The creek, normally a placid stream he could step across, was a 20-foot-wide torrent of brown, churning water, carrying entire trees in its grasp. The small wooden bridge was still there, but just barely. The water was not just under it. It was over it, surging across the slick planks, which vibrated with the force of the current. The horse, Bess, saw the water and reared, her eyes white with terror, pulling back on the lead. No, Talon said, his voice low and firm, pulling her head down. Easy, Hozo, easy. He spoke to her in his own language, the words calm and steady, a rock in the middle of the chaos. He did not pull, he just stood, his hand on her muzzle, letting her feel his absolute, unshakable calm. He stepped onto the bridge. The water was over his knees, cold as death, trying to rip his legs out from under him. The wood was treacherous, slick with mud. He took another step. Come, he said. The horse, trusting the man more than her own eyes, put a hesitant hoof on the plank. The bridge groaned. Talon pulled. Steady pressure. Come. One step at a time. They crossed the world's most dangerous 50 feet. The water surged around them, and the bridge shuddered. But he did not falter. His gaze was fixed on the far bank, a dark blot of land. He was a man walking on water, pulling the beast behind him. They reached the other side. The horse was shaking, her breath coming in great, panicked snorts. Talon did not rest. He slapped her flank. On, he said. The next 5 miles were a nightmare of open flats. There was no cover. The wind hit them with its full, brutal force. The rain turned to sleet, stinging his face. And then the sky ripped open. Lightning struck. A brilliant white-blue fork that hit an oak tree not 100 yards away. The world exploded in a simultaneous crack of light and sound. The horse screamed, a sound of pure terror, and went down, falling to her knees in the mud. Talon was pulled off his feet, landing hard. His shoulder, his bad shoulder, taking the brunt of his fall in the muck. Pain, white-hot and sickening, shot up his neck. He ignored it. He was up in a second, hauling on the reins, shouting at the horse, his voice raw. Up, get up now. He hauled the terrified animal to its feet. He was shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline. He climbed into the saddle. He could not walk. He had to ride. He dug his heels into her flanks, and the heavy horse, terrified of the man more than the storm, broke into a clumsy, sucking trot. He reached the blue saguaro trading post just before dawn. It was a dark, low-slung building of sod and scrap wood. The only light a dim yellow square from a single window. He didn't knock. He hammered on the door with his fist. The sound, a desperate drumbeat. Hemlock, open, open now. A light appeared. The door creaked open. An old man Hemlock stood there in his long johns, a shotgun leveled at Talon's chest. Get off my porch, Apache! Hemlock growled, his eyes still gummy with sleep. Talon didn't move. He was a specter, a thing made of mud and rainwater. His hat was gone. His face was a mask of black mire, his eyes burning out of it. The Pike girl, Talon said, his voice a rasp. She's dying. I need the quinine. Hemlock's eyes narrowed. Fever. Yes. That'll cost you, Hemlock said, the shotgun not wavering. Talon reached inside his wet shirt. He pulled out the leather thong from his neck, and with a single, sharp twist, he ripped the Thunderbird medallion from it. He threw it on the floor of the porch. It landed with a heavy, wet smack. Keep it, Talon panted. The medicine. Hemlock stared at the silver, his eyes wide. He knew Dosella work. That was a fortune. He lowered the shotgun. In the back, he mumbled, shuffling away. He returned a moment later with a small, dark blue bottle. Talon snatched it from his hand, not looking at the silver medallion he had left behind. He was back on the horse and gone, riding into the gray, weeping dawn before Hemlock had even closed the door. He did not remember the ride back. It was a blur of pain, mud, and a single, desperate focus the bottle clutched in his right hand. He held it so tightly his knuckles were white, his hand completely numb. He fell from the horse at the cabin, his legs giving out. He crawled the last 10 feet to the porch, his body a single, screaming ache. Evelyn tore the door open. She had been standing there, watching, for hours. He looked up at her from his hands and knees. He was unrecognizable. He was not a man. He was a creature of earth, covered from his matted hair to his boots in a thick, dripping coat of black mud. A long, bleeding gash was open on his cheek from a branch, but his right hand was held out, his fist clenched. He opened it. The small blue bottle was safe. She snatched it from him, her fingers brushing his, cold as clay. He collapsed onto the porch, pulling himself just inside the threshold, and lay there, utterly spent. As she ran back to her child, she uncorked the bottle, her hands shaking so violently she could barely measure the drops. She forced the bitter liquid between Rosie's blue-tinged lips. Rosie coughed, sputtered, but swallowed. Evelyn sat, the bottle in one hand, Rosie's small, hot hand in the other. She watched. She prayed. Talon lay by the door, his breathing as ragged as the child's. For an hour, nothing. The whistling breath continued. The fever raged. And then it changed. The whistling eased. The terrible, straining fight for air lessened. Rosie's body, which had been rigid and arched, relaxed. A sheen of sweat, real sweat, broke out on her forehead. The fever had broken. Rosie turned her head, her eyes still closed, and let out a long, shuddering sigh. She was asleep, a real, healing sleep. Evelyn did not cry. The tears were frozen. She sat there, rigid, until the sun was fully up, its pale, watery light filling the cabin. She laid Rosie's hand gently on the cot. She stood up on legs that felt like wood. She walked over to where Talon lay. He had not moved. He was shivering, his eyes closed. She knelt beside him. He was caked in mud, his clothes ruined, his body trembling with a deep, bone-rattling chill. "You're mad," she whispered. Her voice was thick, broken. Her eyes were not filled with just gratitude. They were a wild, chaotic mix of awe and anger and a terrifying, profound fear. She was angry that he had risked it. She was terrified that he had almost not returned. She was in awe that he had... His eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, his pale gray gaze fogged with exhaustion. He saw the storm in her eyes. He tried to smile, but it was just a grimace of pain. "Mad," he rasped. His lips cracked. "But the necessary kind." And then a sound escaped Evelyn Pike's throat that she had not made in 3 years. It was not a sob. It was a laugh. It was a short, sharp, hysterical burst of air. It was the sound of a spring uncoiling, of a terror so profound that it could only break in this strange, ragged sound. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It lit the room more than the fireplace. She stopped, as surprised as he was. A real, wet tear finally rolled down her cheek, cutting a path through the soot on her face. "You need to get out of those clothes," she said, her voice suddenly, brusquely practical, "before you catch your death." Later that day, the storm had passed, leaving a clean, scoured world. The cabin was quiet, filled with the warm, rich smell of baking bread. Rosie was sleeping peacefully, her skin cool. Talon sat by the fire, wrapped in one of Thomas's old, clean nightshirts, his wounds cleaned and bound. He was sipping hot, weak coffee. Evelyn pulled a loaf of bread from the small tin oven by the fire. It was dark, crusty, and perfect. She didn't cut it. She broke it. The steam rose from the white, soft center. She didn't say thank you. The words were too small. They were useless. She just handed him the larger half. He took it, his fingers, now clean, brushing hers. They sat in the quiet and ate the warm bread. And it tasted like a promise. It tasted like a battle won. The cabin was quiet. It was a new kind of quiet. For 2 days, the silence had been defined by the high, whistling rasp of Rosie's breathing, a sound that was a constant, tearing reminder of the thin ice they were walking on. Now, that sound was gone. It was replaced by the deep, even breath of a child in a healing sleep. The rain had stopped. The wind was still. The only sounds were the soft hiss of the fire dwindling to coals and the steady, quiet breathing from the cot. Rosie was safe. The adrenaline that had held Evelyn rigid for 48 hours drained away, leaving her bones feeling hollow, her hands shaky. She felt a profound, vibrating exhaustion, but she was too restless to sleep. She needed to do something, some small, normal, human task. She went to the hearth, added a small log to the coals, and swung the kettle over the new flame. She would make coffee. It was a luxury she couldn't afford, but tonight, survival felt like a luxury. Talon sat at the small table, his back to her. He was not idle. He never was. By the light of a single tallow candle, he was mending the 3-legged chair, the one that had sat in the corner for a year, a monument to Evelyn's fatigue. He had found Thomas's small pot of hide glue, warmed it by the fire, and was now carefully fitting the broken spindle back into its socket. His hands, which she had seen covered in mud and blood, moved with a craftsman's precision. He was absorbed in the work, his profile stark in the candlelight. The gash on his cheek from the ride was a dark, clean line. His shoulder, she knew, must be a geography of new pain, but he gave no sign. Evelyn watched him as she waited for the water to heat. She watched the way his fingers tested the fit, the way he applied the glue, the way he used a thin leather thong to bind the joint tight, his pull steady and sure. He was a man who mended things, roofs, harnesses, broken chairs. She poured the steaming water over the coffee grounds, the bitter, rich smell filling the cabin, cutting through the scent of sickness. She poured a cup for herself and one for him, black and strong. She set his on the table beside him. He looked up, his pale gray eyes acknowledging her. He nodded his thanks and took a slow sip, his gaze returning to his work. Evelyn sat on the bench opposite him. The fire crackled. Rosie murmured in her sleep, turning over. The silence between them stretched, but it was no longer the silence of suspicion or tension. It was the shared quiet of survivors, of fellow soldiers after a battle. "Does it tire you?" Evelyn asked, her voice low, startling herself. He paused, his hand on the chair. He looked at her, his brow slightly furrowed in question. "Being so quiet," she clarified, tracing the rim of her tin cup. "Saving your words. You hardly ever speak." "Not really. I wonder if it wears you out." Holding them all in. Talon looked down at the chair leg he had just secured. He ran his thumb over the joint. He seemed to consider the question with the same seriousness he gave to mending the wood. "Out there," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "Words are used up fast. They're cheap. They're used to threaten, or to lie, or to take. They are like dry leaves in the wind." He lifted his gaze to hers. The firelight caught the clear, stone gray of his eyes. "In here," he said, his voice softer, "I want to keep the ones that are true. I don't want to waste them." The simple honesty of it silenced her. She felt a small, strange warmth spread through her chest. Entirely separate from the hot coffee, he gave the leather thong one last, firm pull. "It needs to set by the heat." He stood, lifting the small chair. Evelyn rose at the same time, moving to clear a space for it on the hearth. The cabin was small, the space between the table and the fire cramped. He bent to place the chair on the warm stones, and she bent to steady it, to make sure it wouldn't tip. In that small, shared movement, his shoulder brushed hers. It was nothing, a simple, accidental contact, but it was not nothing. Evelyn froze. She could feel the solid, non-negotiable warmth of him, the hard muscle under his borrowed shirt. It was the first time they had touched in a way that was not born of violence or medical necessity. She could smell the wood smoke on his skin, the clean, sharp scent of the lye soap she had given him. He was so close. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. He paused, his shoulder pressed against hers. He did not pull away. Neither did she. They were still for one. Long, suspended second. Then, together, they straightened up, breaking the contact. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thick, charged. Evelyn turned away quickly, her heart giving a strange, heavy thump. She went back to the fire, her hands suddenly needing to be busy again. The pot of beans from their meager supper was still on the hob, thick and smoky. The last of the salt pork, the bread she had baked. It was the best the house had to offer. It was, she realized, all she had to give. She ladled a heap of beans onto a tin plate. She added a piece of the pork and a thick slice of the bread. It was a poor thank you for a life, but it was all she had. She turned and set the plate on the table in front of him. He looked at the plate, then at her. He had not asked for food. He had not expected it. He sat down, picked up the spoon, and began to eat. He ate the way he did everything slowly, deliberately, with a kind of reverence. He ate as if he were praying. Evelyn sat back down, nursing her coffee, watching him. He was a man who had left a fortune, who had lost a wife, who had nearly died at her fence, and who had just ridden through a storm that should have killed him, all for her child. and he was eating her simple beans as if they were a feast. When he was finished, he set the spoon neatly on the empty plate. He looked at her. His eyes held hers. There was no demand in his gaze, no expectation, but there was no evasion either. He was not the nervous boy in town, or the arrogant rancher, or the weary merchant. He just looked at her, his gaze steady and clear, seeing all the cracks and all the fear she lived with. Her hand was on the table, her fingers wrapped around her warm cup. He moved his own hand, not quickly, not in a way that would startle her. He laid it, palm down, on the rough, scarred wood of the table, his fingers gently brushing the back of her hand. It was not a grab. It was not a caress. It was a placement, a statement. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at his large, brown, calloused hand, dark against her pale skin. It was so strong. It was the hand that had fixed her roof. It was the hand that had held the bottle. It was resting against hers. A silent question. Is this all right? She did not pull away. She could not. Her heart was beating a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She felt a tremor start deep inside her, a trembling in her lips. She could only nod, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. His fingers moved, just slightly, covering hers. A light, gentle pressure, a quiet thank you. It has been, she whispered, her voice thick, breaking the silence. So long, since this house has felt peaceful. She looked up from their hands to his face. It is peaceful, because of you. It was the truest thing she had said in 3 years. He moved then. He shifted on the bench, not rising, but turning toward her. He closed the small distance between them, his knee brushing hers. He stopped when there was only half a breath of space left, his gaze fixed on her face. He was so close. She could see the small flecks of gray in his black hair, the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes. He lifted his free hand, the one that was not covering hers. He moved it slowly, giving her every chance to flinch, to pull back. She did not. His rough fingers touched her cheek, his thumb brushing the side of her mouth. He leaned in. He stopped, his forehead coming to rest gently against hers. They stayed like that, foreheads touching, eyes closing. They breathed in the same small space of air. She breathed in the scent of him smoke, coffee, and the cold night air. He breathed in the scent of her flower, and soap, and the faint, salty trace of her tears. It was a moment of absolute stillness. Then he moved that last, fractional inch. His lips touched hers. The kiss was not what she would have imagined. It was not the hungry, demanding kiss of a desperate man. It was not the rough kiss of a cowboy or the calculated kiss of a merchant. It was slow. It was gentle. It was profoundly respectful. It was a kiss of arrival, of a long, cold journey ending at a warm fire. It was soft, and it was questioning, and it was, in its own way, a prayer, just like how he ate his food. It was the most powerful thing she had ever felt. The kiss ended, but he did not pull away. He just kept his forehead against hers. And then he moved his arms, sliding one around her back, his other hand still on her cheek, and he gently drew her in. She let herself go. Her hands, which had been clutching her cup, came up to rest on the solid wall of his chest. She leaned into him, and he held her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and she buried her face in the curve of his neck, her hands clinging to his shirt. It was not a sexual embrace. It was the embrace of two people who had been utterly alone and were, for one moment, not. It was warmth. It was strength. It was the feeling of a solid roof in a storm. She could feel his heart beating, a strong, slow, steady thump, thump beneath her ear, a rhythm that was as sure as his hammer on the shingles. She was shaking, and he just held her, solid as the earth, until the tremors passed. They stood like that, in the dim light of the dying fire, for a long, long time. There was no hurry. There was nothing but the warmth, and the steady heartbeat, and the scent of smoke and bread. Finally, slowly, they pulled back, just enough to see each other's faces. An awkward, rusty smile touched Evelyn's lips. It was a foreign expression, one she hadn't used in years. He saw it, and the corners of his own mouth lifted in a small, gentle smile of his own. He looked down at his hands, which were now resting on her shoulders. He seemed to be searching for one of his true words. "Every day," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper, so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "Every day, I am learning how to stay." Evelyn looked into his clear, honest eyes. The suspicion she had felt, the fear of the town, the memory of her husband, it was all still there, but it was distant. He was here. He was real. "And I," she whispered back, her voice just as true, "am learning how to trust." The warmth of that night, the impossible, fragile peace, lasted less than a day. It was a false spring, a brief, warm breath before the true, hard winter of their troubles set in. The battle for Rosie's life had been won. The war for the land, and for their right to exist on it, was just beginning. The first shot was not a bullet, it was a whisper, and it was delivered by the only other woman in the valley Evelyn trusted, Martha Leland. Martha was the schoolteacher, a gaunt, stern woman from back east who had come to Dry Willow with a preacher husband and been widowed within a year. She stayed, not out of love for the place, but out of a stubborn refusal to be beaten by it. She was a woman of books, of ink, and of quiet, unshakable principle. She rode her mule out to the cabin 2 days after the storm, under the pretense of bringing a primer for Rosie. Her eyes, sharp behind small spectacles, took in the mended chair by the fire, the neatly stacked wood, and the tall, silent man standing on the porch. She did not flinch. "Evelyn," she said, her voice low, accepting a cup of water but refusing to sit. "I am here as a friend." "I know that, Martha," Evelyn said, her stomach tightening. "Then you must listen. The town is agitated. Ezra Mott's story was poison. Your trip to the store was a defiance, and—" She paused, her lips thinning. "Sheriff Crowder is enjoying the power of it." "What has he done?" Evelyn's voice was flat. "He's drafting a warrant," Martha said, her words clipped and precise, like a school lesson. "I heard him discussing it with Judge Hemlock. There is no real law, of course, but they are calling it willful trespass and racial commingling in defiance of public order. It's nonsense, but it's paper. It's a piece of paper he can use to arrest Mr. Dosella on sight, or worse, to remove Rosie from your care, claiming you are an unfit mother." The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Rosie. They would use her daughter. "That's not all," Martha pressed on, her gaze hardening. "The warrant is Crowder's weapon, but the man loading it is Silas Quince." Talon, who had been standing on the porch, his back to them, turned. His face was unreadable, but his stillness was that of a predator. "Quince was in the saloon 2 nights ago," Martha continued, her voice filled with a cold disgust. "He was drinking, and he was boasting. He says he holds the mortgage on this property. An old note of your husband's. He was laughing. Evelyn, he told the entire bar that fresh water belongs to men with money, not to—" She stopped, her pale skin flushing with anger. "Not to women who would defile their homes. He intends to use this warrant and the town's anger to force you to sell. He will call in the note. He will take the spring." The trap was laid, and it was perfect. Evelyn felt the cold cabin floor beneath her feet as if she were about to fall through it. After Martha left, her mule disappearing down the muddy track, the silence in the cabin was terrible. It was the silence of 2 people trapped in a closing box. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice a dry rasp. "She's right. He'll take Rosie. He'll use you to take my daughter." Talon stood by the window, looking out at the land he had helped her defend. He looked at the cross they had planted by the spring. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like a cold stone, what he had to do. He had been a fool. He had been so busy learning to stay that he had forgotten the consequences. His presence, which he had intended as a shield, was the very weapon they were using to destroy her. By staying, he was not protecting her. He was making her a target. "Yes," he said, his voice low. "They will." He turned to face her. The softness from their night by the fire was gone. His eyes were the color of the stones in a cold, fast river. "I must go," he said. "No," she cried, the word torn from her. "You can't. That's what he wants. If you leave, I'll be alone. He'll win." "He will win if I stay," Talon said, his voice flat with a terrible finality. "He will use the paper from the sheriff. He will use my name. He will take your child. And you will be alone anyway." He walked to the hearth, to the small deerskin pouch he had hidden there weeks ago. He took it out. "I came here as a man with nothing," he said, his voice so low she had to lean in. "I was running from a name. I see now that running is not enough. A man with nothing cannot fight a man who owns the paper. I cannot protect you with just my hands." "Talon, don't," she whispered, her hands clenched at her sides. He turned, his eyes burning into hers. "I am going to Salt River Draw. I am going to reclaim the name I threw away. Not the hate or the feuds, but the power of it. I am going to become the man who can fight Silas Quince on his own ground. I am going to fight his paper with my paper." He took her hands. They were cold, trembling. "You said you were learning to trust," he said, his voice rough. "Trust me now. This is not leaving. This is preparing." He pulled the small pouch of silver from his shirt. The 3 coins he had, he pressed them into her palm and closed her fingers around them. "This is all I have. It is not enough. Not yet, but when the roads are dry, and I have what I need, I will come back. I will come back with enough strength to shelter you both from this wind. For good." He kissed her. Once. It was not the gentle kiss of their previous night. It was a hard, desperate, brutal kiss. A promise and a farewell. A brand of his intention. It was over as fast as it began. "Bar the door behind me," he said, "and do not open it for anyone but me." He was gone before the sun rose. She stood at the window, her hand pressed against the cold glass, and watched his dark shape move across the muddy flat, past the defiant cross, and disappear into the pre-dawn gloom. She did not cry. She just felt the warmth drain from the world, leaving her colder than the snow had ever made her. The town did not wait. The shunning was immediate and absolute. When she rode the mule to Dry Willow for supplies using the silver he had given her, the world changed. The stairs were no longer curious. They were knives. Mr. Whitcomb served her, but he did not speak. He slapped her flour onto the counter and swept her coins into his drawer, his face a mask of pinched, moral outrage. The women, who had once nodded to her in sympathy, crossed the muddy street to avoid walking on the same boardwalk. She walked with her back straight. She held her chin high. She looked every man and woman in the eye, her own gaze as cold and hard as theirs. She was the Widow Pike of Painted Butte, and she would not be bowed. But at night, the straightness of her back broke. She would sit at the small table after Rosie was asleep, the cabin silent and empty, the chill of his absence a physical ache. She would open the small journal where she kept her accounts, but the pages were blank. She would sit, her pen in her hand, and stare at the empty page as a single, hot tear would fall, then another, splashing onto the ruled lines, a silent testament to a loneliness that was deeper than any she had ever known. The pressure mounted. Crowder, angry that his quarry had flown, signed the arrest warrant anyway. To be served on sight, it read. He posted it in the saloon. A public threat. Silas Quince, emboldened, sent his men. They did not ride in daylight. They came at night. At first, it was just sounds. A horse whinnying, too close to the barn. A man's low laugh in the darkness. Then, they grew bolder. Evelyn would wake to the sound of a rock hitting the roof, a thud that would make Rosie cry out. One morning, she woke to find they had torn down the cross by the spring. She rebuilt it. The next morning, they had driven a dozen new red stakes, claiming the entire creek. She pulled them out, one by one, her hands bleeding. She was alone, and she was terrified. The waiting was eating her alive. She was just a woman, waiting for a man to save her. No. The thought hit her with the force of a physical revelation. She was not the woman she had been when the snow fell. She had held her ground. She had pulled a man from the snow. She had faced down a town. She would not just wait. She put on her coat. She told Rosie to play by the fire. She locked the door, laid the rifle by the wall, and she walked. She walked the 4 miles to Dry Willow, not to the store, but to the small, clapboard schoolhouse at the edge of town. Martha Leland was inside, cleaning her chalkboards. She looked up, startled, as Evelyn pushed the door open. "Evelyn, it's not safe for you in town. Crowder?" "I am not here about Crowder," Evelyn said, her voice shaking but hard. "I am here because you are a teacher. You understand paper, and you are my friend. I need your help." Martha put the rag down. "What kind of help? Quince is using paper to steal my land." Talon went to fight him with paper. But this is my land, Thomas's land. I will not sit and wait to be rescued. There must be something, a deed, a right, something." A slow, fierce smile spread across Martha's thin face. "Well," she said, untying her apron, "then we had better start reading." They returned to the cabin, Martha carrying a lantern and a satchel of books. They locked the door. They lit every candle Evelyn had, and they began to tear apart Thomas's old, dusty roll-topped desk. It was a history of a man's life, full of failures and small hopes. There were receipts for seed, bills of sale for horses, letters from his family back in Illinois, and under a pile of dried-out tobacco, there was a heavy leather ledger, the land book. They paged through it, their fingers black with dust and old ink. It was mostly a record of trap lines and fences. But in the back, tucked into a flap, was the original survey deed, the paper Thomas had signed when he bought the land from the territorial office. Martha's finger ran across the spidery, formal script. "This is it, the original plat map. Look." Her voice grew tight. She pointed to a line of text, written in a different hand, a fast, scribbled addendum at the bottom, but bearing the same official red ink stamp of the Mesa County clerk. Addendum per Territorial Accord of 1851, the water source known as Pike's Spring, situated at coordinate, shall be held as a communal water clause, accessible to adjoining properties in times of drought, the boundary to remain inviolate. Evelyn stared at the words, not understanding. "Don't you see?" Martha breathed, her eyes blazing behind her spectacles. "He can't move the boundary. He can't claim the spring. It's a communal water clause. It's not just your water. It's everyone's. He's not just stealing from you. He's stealing from the whole valley. But who would enforce it? The law will enforce it," Martha said, her voice like steel. "But it needs a witness. The clause is valid. It says, 'if witnessed by the clerk and one other signatory.'" Evelyn looked at the bottom of the page. There was the clerk's signature, and below it, a name she did not recognize, attested by S. Quince. Evelyn looked up, confused. "Quince, he signed it. He must have?" Martha whispered, her mind racing. "He must have been the adjoining landowner. He knew all along. He's not just trying to steal the land. He's trying to bury his own signature." Evelyn looked at the paper, this small, dusty, ink-stained paper. It was not a defense. It was a weapon. She was no longer waiting. She was preparing. She went to the hearth, not to cry, but to stoke the fire. She put the kettle on. She would make coffee. There was work to do. A new kind of fire was kindled in the kitchen of a gentle woman. It was not the warm fire of the hearth. It was the cold, white-hot fire of coming revenge. The wait stretched into weeks. The last of the snow vanished from the high ridges, and the mud dried into a hard, cracked pan surface. The world turned a tentative, fragile green. Spring, when it finally came to Painted Butte, arrived with a fierce, desperate beauty. Evelyn planted a small garden. She and Rosie were on their knees in the dark, turned earth by the cabin wall, pressing small, precious seeds into the soil. When they heard it, it was not the sound of one or two riders, picking their way through the mud. This was the sound of purpose, The steady, rhythmic thump of half a dozen shod horses. Moving fast. Moving as a unit. Evelyn was on her feet in an instant, grabbing Rosie's hand and pulling her back toward the cabin. Her eyes flew to Coyote Ridge, her heart a cold hammer in her chest. Had Quince finally decided to stop sending men in the night? Was this it? 4 riders crested the ridge, dark silhouettes against the bright spring sky. They were not Quince's men. They did not slouch. They did not meander. They rode like cavalry, their lines clean, their pace even. They descended the slope and made straight for her cabin, their gear fine, their horses magnificent. Deep-chested animals that moved with an expensive, easy power. They reined in 20 yards from the porch. Evelyn stood frozen, her hand clutching Rosie's, her other hand flat against the cabin wall. The lead rider swung down from his horse, his movements fluid and sure. It was Talon. But it was not the Talon who had left. The half-starved, haunted man in borrowed clothes was gone. This man was solid, powerful. His hair was clean, tied back in a neat queue. His face was shaven, revealing the strong, clean lines of his jaw and chin. He wore a dark, beautifully cut canvas coat and fine leather boots. And at his throat, hanging not from a cheap thong, but from a heavy, intricate silver chain, gleaming in the morning sun, was the Thunderbird. It was no longer a hidden relic. It was a badge of office. He did not smile. His face was grave, his eyes locked on hers, 1,000 unsaid words passing between them. He looked at her, then at Rosie, and the hardness in his eyes softened with a profound, aching relief. "Evelyn," he said. His voice was the same, but the doubt was gone. A second rider dismounted. It was a woman. She was, Evelyn thought, the most formidable woman she had ever seen. She was tall, dressed in a practical split skirt of dark wool, with a man's hat, and her black hair was tied in a single, thick braid. Her face was sharp, intelligent, and her eyes missed nothing. They swept over the cabin, the new planted cross at the spring, the patched roof, and Rosie, all in one swift, assessing glance. "Evelyn Pike," Talon said, moving to her side. "This is my cousin, Esme Docella. She manages the Docella stock and trading operations." Esme stepped forward and nodded, a short, clipped gesture of respect. "Mrs. Pike, you have a fine piece of land here." Her voice was crisp, educated. The 2 other riders, lean, hard-looking Apache men, dismounted and, without a word, began to unlash a heavy, steel-banded chest from a pack mule. They carried it to the porch and set it down with a heavy, final thud. The small cabin was suddenly, impossibly crowded. The air crackled with a new, strange power. Esme and Talon stood by the hearth, the 2 riders by the door. Talon looked around the small room, at the mended chair, at the hearth where he had almost died, at the cot where Rosie now hid, peeking out. "I told you I was going to fight paper with paper," he said, his voice low. "I did not tell you the whole truth." He looked at Esme, then back to Evelyn. "My father, Chayton, and I, we did not see the world the same way. I left Salt River Draw 2 years ago. I left the name. I left the silver, the horses, the power. I wanted to see what a man was worth without it." His eyes found hers, and the vulnerability was back, just for a second. "I found out here, alone, a man is worth very little. He is worth 1 meal, 1 fire, 1 act of kindness." He paused, taking a breath. "I went back to Salt River Draw, not as the beggar who left, but as the son, the legal heir to all of it. I left to learn humility. I have returned to use the power I ran from, and I will use it right." Evelyn stared at him, trying to absorb the sheer scale of the change. This was the millionaire. This was the prince. Esme, seeing Evelyn's confusion, stepped forward. She was all business. She placed her leather satchel on the table and opened the steel-bound chest. It was not full of gold. It was full of ledgers, account books, deeds, and stacks of paper, all tied in neat bundles. "Mrs. Pike," Esme began, her voice precise. "While Mr. Docella was away, we kept watch over the business. We learned that a local rancher, Silas Quince, had made a formal inquiry at the Mesa Mutual Bank in the county seat. Evelyn's heart clenched. The mortgage, my husband's note. Precisely, Esme said. She pulled a ledger from the chest. Mr. Quince sought to purchase your delinquent note, to use it as leverage to foreclose and seize your land. He is a small man. He thinks in small, crude ways. Esme's lips thinned in a smile that held no humor. He did not do his research. He did not realize that the Docella Trading and Stock, for the past 5 years, has been the largest single depositor and private investor in the Mesa Mutual Bank. Our assets secure nearly 40% of their operating capital. Evelyn could only stare. She did not understand high finance. She only understood the threat. When we received word, Esme continued, that Mr. Quince was attempting to use our bank to perpetrate a land fraud against a friend of the family, we decided to simplify our investment. We did not just buy your note, Mrs. Pike. We bought the bank's entire portfolio of outstanding commercial and agricultural loans for this district. Mr. Quince, as of 3 days ago, now pays his own substantial mortgages to us. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the move left Evelyn speechless. This was not a fistfight. This was a war fought with ink and gold, on a scale she could not have imagined. Esme pulled a single, dog-eared, familiar-looking document from the chest. It was the original mortgage note, the paper that had been a death sentence hanging over her for 3 years. She handed it, and a small, silver inkwell and pen. To Talon. We are your new creditors, Talon said, his voice soft. He took the pen. He did not hesitate. He dipped it, and in strong, clear letters across the face of the note, he wrote, paid in full, forgiven. Docella Trading Stock. He held the paper out to her. Evelyn's hand, raw and dirt-stained from the garden, trembled as she took it. She stared at the wet ink, the weight of the debt, the sleepless nights, the terror of Quince in the winter. It all evaporated in that one moment. This small piece of paper was her freedom. It was her home. It was her daughter's future. Tears she had refused to shed for months welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. She looked up at Talon, unable to speak, her throat thick. The moment of profound peace was shattered. A horse thundered into the yard, its sides heaving, foam flying from its bit. A fifth rider, a Docella ranch hand, threw himself from the saddle before the horse had even stopped. "Talon Esme!" he yelled, bursting through the door. "It's the South Arroyo. A fire. It's moving west, fast, straight for the summer pasture." Esme was instantly transformed. "How many head?" she snapped. "Near 500. The man panted. "And the fences are cut." It was set. Thomas Vale and 2 of Quince's men were seen riding hard south just an hour before. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Quince? He had lost the paper war, so he had started a war of fire. It was his retaliation, and it was aimed at the heart of the Docella wealth. Talon's face became a mask of cold, controlled fury. He was no longer the quiet man mending a chair. He was a chief. "Get the horses," he commanded. "Esme, the fire blankets from the chest. Riders, water canteens. We go, now." He turned, grabbing the rifle he had brought with him. Evelyn grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his coat. "No," she cried. "Talon, please, you just got back, look." She held up the canceled mortgage note. "We won. It's over. This is a trap. He wants to draw you out, onto his land. Don't go. Don't let him burn what you've just found." Talon stopped. He put his hand over hers, his fingers covering the paper. "This paper," he said, his voice a low, hard rumble, "is worthless if we let him turn the land it represents to ash. This is why I came back. Evelyn, not just to stop him, to end him. The roof is fixed. The debt is paid. Now I must put out the fire." He turned to his team. "We ride." They mounted up. A small, efficient team of 5, thundering out of the yard. They took the main track, the one that led past the edge of Dry Willow, a cloud of dust rising behind them. They were not halfway to the arroyo when a single figure blocked the road. Sheriff Boone Crowder sat on his horse, his heavy gut straining his shirt, his hand resting on his pistol. His face was red, puffed up with his own small, important authority. "That's far enough, Docella," Crowder bellowed, a triumphant smirk on his face. "You set one foot off that road, and you're in violation. I have a warrant here for your arrest. Willful trespass and racial commingling." He started to pull the folded, sweat-stained paper from his coat pocket. He thought he had his man. Talon began to rein in, his hand moving slowly toward the rifle in his saddle scabbard. "I will handle this." Esme's voice was like a chip of ice. She smoothly maneuvered her horse between Talon and the sheriff. She did not look intimidated. She looked bored. "Sheriff Crowder," she said, her voice carrying in the clear air, "you are interfering with an emergency response to a fire, which is a territorial crime." "I'm enforcing the law," Crowder blustered, waving his paper. "I have a warrant, signed by Judge Hemlock himself." "Your warrant," Esme said, "is meaningless." She reached into her own fine leather satchel. She produced a crisp, heavy, folded document bearing a large, impressive wax seal. "This, however, is an injunction from the Territorial Circuit Court in the Capitol, signed 2 days ago by Judge Harlan Voss." Crowder's smirk vanished. His face went slack. Judge Hemlock was a local political hack. Judge Voss was a federal appointee. He was real. "This document," Esme continued, her voice cold and clear, enjoying the moment, "names you, Sheriff Boone Crowder, and your associate, Mr. Silas Quince, by name. It hereby prohibits you, under penalty of federal law, from approaching, harassing, detaining, or otherwise interfering with any employee, asset, or business operation of the Docella Trading and Stock Company, pending a full investigation into your conspiracy to commit land fraud and intimidation." She held the paper up. The seal glinted. "Your saloon warrant just met the actual law. Sheriff, now, I suggest you get out of our way. We have a fire to put out, unless you would like to add obstruction of a federal court order to your list of coming indictments." Crowder's face, usually a ruddy purple, went a pale, sickly, mottled white. His hand, which had been on his gun, dropped to his side as if it had been burned. He stared at the seal on the paper. He knew what it meant. It meant his comfortable little kingdom, his petty authority, his power to bully and frighten was over. He had been checkmated. He did not speak. He could not. "I thought not," Esme said. She carefully folded the document and put it away. Talon looked at Crowder. One long, final, cold look. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He spurred his horse. "Yeah!" The Docella team thundered forward. They parted around the frozen, humiliated sheriff, leaving him alone in the middle of the road. He was a defeated man, holding a useless piece of paper, choking on the dust of a power he had never known existed. They saw the smoke from 10 miles away, a thick, greasy column of black that clawed at the clean blue sky. It was not a grass fire. It was a fire of malice. As they drew closer, the sound came to them, a low, terrifying roar, and the air grew hot, choked with a gray snow of falling ash. When they crested the last ridge, they saw the full horror of it. The South Arroyo, a wide, fertile pasture shielded by canyon walls, was a cauldron of flame. The wind, cruel and hot, was driving the fire west, pushing it toward the narrow box canyon that held 500 head of Docella's finest horses and cattle. The sky was a bruised, sickening red. The heat was a physical blow, baking their faces, stinging their lungs. "Esme?" Talon's voice was a blade, sharp and clear above the roar. He was no longer the quiet man of the cabin. He was a chief in command. "Take 2 men ride wide, around the north rim. Get behind the herd, push them out, upwind, toward the rocky flats. Use the fire blankets, go now." Esme did not question. She yanked her horse's head, her face a grim mask, and disappeared into the smoke with 2 of the riders. "We dig," Talon yelled to his remaining man. "We need a fire break. Here, at the narrow neck. It's our only chance." They leaped from their horses, grabbing shovels and axes from their saddle packs. The ground was already hot. They worked with a furious, desperate speed, not digging a trench, but scraping the earth bare, clearing a wide, frantic line of dry grass and brush, hacking down to the dark, mineral soil. If the fire hit this, it might pause, might give Esme the precious minutes she needed. The thud of the axes and the panicked, rhythmic scrape of the shovels was a small sound against the furnace roar of the fire. In the distance, through the smoke, they could hear the high, terrified screaming of the horses. They had cleared 30, maybe 40 yards, their lungs on fire, their bodies drenched in sweat, when the first torch flew. It arced out of the rocks above them, a burning, oil-soaked rag on a stick, sailing over their heads. It landed in the dry grass behind their firebreak, instantly starting a new, vicious blaze, cutting off their line of retreat. Damn them. Talon's rider swore, spinning to beat at the new flames with his heavy canvas jacket. Another torch flew, landing closer to the main pasture. "They're trying to circle us," Talon roared, his eyes scanning the rocks. Through the swirling, acrid smoke, he saw them. 3 figures on horseback, dark silhouettes against the red sky, their faces masked by bandanas. Quince's men, one of them, a big man on a heavy bay horse, lit another torch. He balanced it, preparing to throw it into a dense, dry patch of timber that would turn the entire canyon into an inferno, sealing the herd's fate. No, Talon vaulted onto his horse. He didn't reach for his rifle. He kicked the animal, charging straight up the rocky, treacherous incline. A reckless, impossible move. The man on the bay, his arm cocked back, saw him coming, his eyes wide with shock. He threw the torch wildly. Talon, his horse hitting its stride, leaned far out of his saddle, a fluid, breathtaking motion. He snatched the burning torch out of the air as his horse galloped past, his hand never faltering. He didn't stop. He wheeled his horse, his arm still holding the flame, and spurred it 20 yards to a stagnant pool of mud and water. He threw the torch into it. It died with a furious, wet hiss. He turned his horse. The 3 riders had regrouped, their hands dropping to the pistols on their belts. "Enough!" Talon's voice was not a shout. It was a low, vibrating command that seemed to shake the hot air. "This is over. The land is done with you." Thomas Vale, Quince's foreman, the big man on the bay, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "This ain't your land, Docella, and you ain't in charge. This is Quince's country." He pulled his gun. Vale fired. The shot was a flat crack in the roar of the fire, the bullet whining past Talon's ear. Talon didn't go for his own gun. He kicked his horse forward, charging again. Vale, panicked, fired a second time, the shot going high and wide. Before he could lever a third round, Talon was on him. He didn't try to pull him from the saddle. He launched himself from his own horse, a flying tackle, his shoulder hitting Vale square in the chest. The 2 men crashed from the bay's back, landing hard in the hot ash and mud, rolling in a choking cloud of dust. They came up swinging. Vale was heavier, a brute of a man, and he roared, his fists like sledgehammers. He lunged, a wild, wide punch. Talon moved under it, his motion fluid as water. He drove his own fist deep into Vale's soft gut. The man folded with an explosive woof of air. The other 2 riders, seeing their leader down, spurred their horses forward. Raising their pistols, a single, clean shot rang out. Not from them. Talon's rider, who had beaten out the spot fire, was on one knee, his rifle rock steady, aimed at them. "The next one," the rider called calmly, "is for meat." The 2 men froze. Vale, on his knees, roared with rage and pain. He pulled a long, wicked-looking skinning knife from the sheath on his belt. He surged to his feet, lunging at Talon. Talon didn't back away. He moved inside the lunge, his left hand catching Vale's knife wrist, his right hand grabbing the front of the man's shirt. He twisted, using Vale's own heavy momentum, and pivoted on his heel. He threw the bigger man clean over his hip. Thomas Vale landed with a sickening, heavy thud. Flat on his back, the wind was knocked out of him. and the knife flew from his numb, tingling fingers. Before he could even gasp, Talon was on him, one knee pinning his chest, his own small, bone-handled knife, the one Evelyn had found, pressed hard against the soft, sweaty flesh under Vale's jaw. Vale went rigid. His eyes, wide with terror, stared past Talon's shoulder at the smoke-red sky. The point of the knife bit into his skin, a single drop of blood welling. Talon was breathing hard, his face a mask of ash and sweat. His pale gray eyes were chips of ice. He could end it. He could end this man. End the threat. Right here, in the dirt. One quick, hard movement. He held the blade there for one long, silent second. The roar of the fire filled the world. Then, with a low growl of disgust, he pulled the knife back. "No, you're not worth the blood." He grabbed the lariat from his saddle horn and, with a series of efficient, brutal yanks, tied Vale's hands and feet. He stood, leaving Quince's foreman trussed like a calf, sputtering and cursing in the dirt. "Take him," Talon called to his rider. "Bind him and take him to Esme. He's her problem now. We have to finish the fire break." He turned, grabbing his shovel. But as he did, he stopped. A sound, or rather, a sudden, heavy lack of it. The wind, the hot, driving wind, had vanished. The air was dead, still, and impossibly heavy. The smoke, no longer fanning west, was rising in a single, choking column, straight toward the sky. A single, fat drop of rain hit the back of Talon's neck. It hissed on the hot, baked earth. Another, then another, and then, as if God had finally tilted his hand, the sky tore open. It was not a gentle spring shower. It was a cloudburst, a sudden, violent deluge. Cold rain fell in solid, gray sheets, hammering the fire. The sound of the inferno was replaced by a colossal, world-ending hiss. Steam rose in a massive, white cloud that blinded them, a fog of war and relief. Talon stood in the middle of the half-finished firebreak, his shovel hanging limply from his hand. He tilted his head back, closing his eyes, letting the cold, clean water wash the soot and the grime from his face. From the north, through the steam and the downpour, came the sound of whoops and cheers. Esme's riders. The herd was safe. The fire, beaten by a power far greater than any of them, was dying. It sputtered, it hissed, it smoked, a great angry beast being drowned. Beaten back into the mud, he did not ride home right away. He stayed until Esme's riders had rounded up the last of the scattered horses, until the last ember was a cold, black soup, until Thomas Vale was slung over a horse and being led back toward Salt River Draw, where a federal marshal, summoned by Esme, would be waiting. It was nearly dusk when he rode back to the cabin. Alone, he was a man hollowed out. Every muscle in his body was a separate, screaming ache. His shoulder was a deep, throbbing fire. His hands were raw, blistered from the shovel's handle. He was covered, caked in a thick, gray paste of ash, sweat, and rain. He slid from his horse, his legs buckling the moment his boots touched the ground. He stumbled, catching himself on the porch rail. He stood there for a long moment, his head bowed, his body shaking with an exhaustion so deep it felt like the grave. The cabin door flew open. Evelyn stood there. She had been watching, waiting, her face a pale, tight mask in the growing twilight. She saw him, not the conquering hero, not the millionaire prince, but just the man, covered in filth, his fine coat singed at the edges, looking as if he were being held up only by stubbornness. She ran to him. She didn't speak. She didn't ask if he had won. She just ran, her hands flying to his chest, pressing flat against the hard muscle, as if to physically reassure herself that he was real, that he was solid. She felt it, his heart, a strong, steady, thump, 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 pounding under her palm. He was alive. Talon let out a breath he felt he had been holding since he left her weeks ago. He closed his eyes, and his arms came up, his hands, black with soot and grime, sinking into her clean hair, pulling her tight against him. They clung to each other on the small porch, in the light, misty rain that was all that was left of the storm. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her flower and soap and home, a scent that washed the smoke and the fury from his lungs. She held him, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, feeling the deep, violent shudders of exhaustion run through his body. He pulled back, just enough to look at her. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs smudging streaks of gray ash onto her cheeks. She didn't notice. She didn't care. He leaned down, and she met him halfway. The kiss was not the gentle exploration of their first night. It was not the sharp, desperate kiss of farewell. This was a kiss of profound, shuddering relief. It was deep, and it was sustained. A long, claiming kiss that tasted of ash and rain and the metallic tang of survival. It was a kiss that said, "You are alive. I am alive. We are here." It was hungry, and it was hot, and it was, in its heart, a promise of peace. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. The world was a soft, wet gray. Evelyn rested her forehead against his, just as she had before. Her hands were still flat on his chest, feeling his heart. "This house," she whispered, her voice trembling, but strong. "It doesn't bow to the wind anymore." She looked up, her eyes finding his in the dusk, shining with tears she would not shed. "And neither do I." A small, exhausted smile touched his lips. He reached into his coat. His hand came out, and in his palm lay the Thunderbird medallion. The rain had washed it clean, and it gleamed in the dim light. "When I was freezing in the snow," he said, his voice low and rough. "I held on to this. I thought it was my connection to my father, to who I was." He unclaced the heavy silver chain. "I was wrong. It was just a piece of silver. It had no warmth." He lifted the chain and fastened it around her neck. The metal was cold from the rain, heavy and solid against her skin. "It belongs," he whispered, his fingers brushing her collarbone, "where it was kept warm, with the woman who knows what is truly worth holding on to." Evelyn's hand came up, her fingers closing over the heavy silver. It felt like an anchor, grounding her. The cabin door creaked open. Rosie stood there, rubbing her eyes, her small white nightshirt dragging on the floor. She looked at her mother, at the strange, ash-covered man her mother was holding so tightly. "Mama," Rosie's voice was sleepy, small. "The fire, is it all out?" Evelyn did not take her eyes off Talon. She saw the fire still burning in his gaze, the exhaustion, the victory, the profound, steady love. She smiled, a real, true smile, and put her hand on his ash-stained cheek. "There is one left, sweetheart," she answered, "and it's safe. It's right here." Market day was the pulse of Dry Willow. It was the one day a month the valley came alive. The dusty main street crowded with farm wagons, tethered horses, and families trading eggs, gossip, and news. It was a day of community, and it was the perfect day for a public execution. The Docella team did not arrive like a whisper. They arrived like the territorial governor, at precisely 10 in the morning, when the street was thickest. Talon, Esme, and their 2 riders trotted their fine horses down the center of the road. They did not stop at the general store. They did not stop at the livery. They rode to the very epicenter of the town's life, the wide, dusty patch of ground in front of the Dusty Spur Saloon. The 2 riders dismounted, walked into the saloon, and, without a word, carried out one of the heavy oak card tables. They set it in the middle of the square, like a judge's bench. The town went quiet. Wagons stopped rolling. Haggling ceased. All eyes turned. Talon and Esme dismounted. From the steel-bound chest, they did not pull rifles. They pulled paper. Esme, her face impassive, began to lay out the documents, one by one. She used 4 small, heavy silver ingots as paperweights, their dull gleam catching the morning sun. First, she laid down the territorial injunction, the one signed by Judge Harlan Voss, its wax seal a bloody, official red. Next, she laid out the canceled mortgage note, the words "paid in full," a dark scar across its face. Beside that, she unrolled a large, beautiful survey map of the valley, the Pike homestead and its spring clearly marked in blue ink. Talon stood beside her, his hands resting on his belt. He wore the same fine coat, his face clean-shaven, the Thunderbird at his throat. He was not a supplicant. He was a landowner, waiting. It did not take long. "What in the hell?" a voice bellowed. "Is the meaning of this?" Silas Quince shouldered his way through the gathering crowd, his face a blotchy, furious purple. His foreman, Vale, was not with him, but 3 of his other hired hands were close behind. Sheriff Boone Crowder, his own face pale and sweaty, pushed through at his side. "This is a public nuisance. Docella," Quince roared, stabbing a thick finger at the table. "You're blocking the street. This is my town." "This," Esme said, her voice clear and carrying, silencing the crowd, "is a public announcement, a clarification of property lines. Mr. Quince, since you seem to have had some trouble reading them in the dark." The crowd murmured. They had all heard about the fire. They had all heard about the federal injunction. "That's enough," Crowder snarled, stepping forward, his hand resting on his pistol. He was trying to reclaim his authority. "I already told you, Docella, you are in violation of a standing warrant. You are in violation of a federal court order." "Sheriff," Esme snapped, her voice like ice. "An order which explicitly names you." She tapped the injunction. "But we are not here today about the fire, or the fact that Mr. Thomas Vale is currently in federal custody for attempted arson." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was the first they had heard of it. "We are here," Esme continued, her gaze sweeping the crowd, "about the water. We are here about a crime that happened long before Mr. Docella ever set foot in this valley. A crime of theft, not just against Mrs. Pike, but against every one of you." Quince laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Theft. That woman is a squatter on land I hold the note for. That spring is mine." "The note," Talon said, his voice a low, calm rumble, "is paid." He tapped the mortgage document. "We own the note, and we have forgiven it. The Pike land is free and clear." Quince's face went slack. He stared at the paid in full, his small, greedy eyes wide with disbelief. "But the note is not the point," Talon continued, turning to the crowd. "The land was never the point. It was the water. Water he intended to steal from all of you." He unrolled the second document. The original, dusty deed that Evelyn and Martha had found. He held it up for all to see. "This is the original territorial deed for the Pike homestead, filed in the county seat 18 years ago. I will read you the addendum, signed and sealed by the clerk." His voice rang out, clear and steady. "Per territorial accord of 1851, the water source known as Pike's Spring shall be held as a communal water clause, accessible to adjoining properties in times of drought, the boundary to remain inviolate." A new silence fell over the crowd, a heavy, angry silence. The ranchers in the back, the ones who had sided with Quince, looked at each other. A communal clause. That meant, in the dry season, they had a right to that water. Quince had not just been choking off a widow. He had been choking off them. "That's a lie," Quince sputtered, his eyes wild. "That's a forgery. It is not." "It is." A new voice, thin but strong as steel, cut through. Martha Leland, the schoolteacher, stepped out of the crowd. She was standing with Evelyn, who watched, her face pale, her hand gripping the Thunderbird at her throat. "I have seen this document," Martha announced, her gaze sweeping over her neighbors. "I recognize the signature of the late Thomas Pike. I have seen it on his ledgers 100 times. It is genuine." "And what of the other signature?" Esme asked, her voice dangerously pleasant. "The witness, the adjoining landowner who attested to this public right." She tapped the bottom of the deed. "Attested by Silas Quince." The crowd turned, as one, to look at the rancher, the men who had drunk his whiskey, the men who had worked for him, the men who had laughed at the widow. They all looked at him with a new, cold understanding. He had not just lied. He had betrayed the entire valley. The men who had once spit at Evelyn's feet, the ones who had called her names, now shuffled their boots in the dust. They looked down, their faces red with a shame that was hotter than any fire. This is illegal," Crowder blustered, his authority in tatters. He was a cornered animal, and he did the only thing he knew. He reached for his handcuffs. "This is a conspiracy. You are all under arrest, you. Docela, you. Woman." He lunged for Talon. "That's enough. Boone!" The voice was not loud, but it was firm. Deputy Lane, Crowder's mousy, overlooked assistant, stepped between the sheriff and Talon. "What?" Crowder roared. "Get out of my way. Lane, that's an order." "I'm afraid I can't do that," Lane said, his hand moving to his own coat. He, too, pulled out a piece of paper. It was a telegram. This arrived on the morning stage. "Sheriff, from the Territorial Marshal, confirming Judge Voss's injunction. It is a formal writ." Lane took a deep breath, and his voice grew steady. "By the authority of the United States Territorial Court, you are hereby suspended from your duties. Boone Crowder, pending a full federal investigation into abuse of power, conspiracy to commit fraud, and willful dereliction of your oath. You are to surrender your badge and your firearm. To me." Crowder's world ended. His face, his authority, his very identity, collapsed. He stared at the telegram, his mouth working, but no sounds coming out. Quince saw it. He saw his power, his ally, his entire plan. Turned to ash. He was ruined. The land was lost. The water was lost. The respect of the town was lost. He was a thief, exposed in the public square. He did what all cowards do when their paper fails. He reached for steel. It was a clumsy, desperate, furious motion. He tore his revolver from its holster, his face a mask of primal rage, his arm coming up. "Evelyn." Talon didn't draw. He moved. In one explosive motion, he grabbed Evelyn and threw her to the ground, shielding her body with his own as the crowd screamed. Bang! A single shot, deafening in the square. It was not from Quince. Quince froze, his own pistol still pointing at the sky. He stared, dumbfounded. Esme Docela stood by the table, her own small, silver-plated revolver held steady in her hand. Smoke was curling from its barrel. She had not aimed at Quince. She had aimed above him. The big wooden sign for the Dusty Spur Saloon, which hung over Quince's head, shuddered. The nail holding it had been shot clean through. The heavy sign tipped, then crashed to the boardwalk at Quince's feet with a sound of splintering wood, showering him in dust and splinters. Quince stared at the broken sign, then at Esme's smoking gun, then at Talon, who was now slowly rising, helping Evelyn to her feet. Deputy Lane, his face set in hard, new lines, did not hesitate. He kicked Quince's pistol from his numb hand, spun him around, and snapped the sheriff's own handcuffs onto his wrists. "Silas Quince," Lane said, his voice loud for all to hear. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, for fraud, and for attempted murder." It was over. The crowd stood in stunned silence. They watched as Deputy Lane cuffed the richest man in the valley. They watched as Boone Crowder, his face the color of wet ash, slowly, painfully, unpinned his tin star and handed it to his deputy. And then the crowd moved. The men, the women, the children, who had formed a tight, angry circle, parted. They stepped back, clearing a path. They created a wide, open lane in the dust, a path that led from the steps of the saloon, past the table of justice, to where Talon and Evelyn stood. It was a path of respect, a path of honor. Talon brushed the dust from Evelyn's dress. He ignored the cuffed men. He ignored the staring crowd. He looked only at her. His face was no longer hard, no longer the face of a chief at war. It was the face of the man who had sat by her fire. "I came to this valley," he said, his voice low, "for her alone. A man running from a name. I came here to build, Evelyn, not to take. If you will allow me." He took her hands, her strong, calloused hands, stained with garden soil. "I would like to build my roof here, with you, forever." Evelyn's eyes filled with the tears she had held back for so long. She looked at this man, this warrior, this prince, who had gone to war for her. She had no words. She didn't need them. Her hand, trembling, lifted, not to wipe her tears, but to touch the heavy, solid weight of the Thunderbird medallion that rested at her throat. Her fingers closed over it, clutching it. A promise. A vow. Her yes. He understood. He pulled her to him. And in the middle of the street, in front of the silenced town, they held each other. It was not a kiss of passion, but an embrace of profound, total, and final homecoming. And from the steps of the general store, where she had been watching with Martha Leland, Rosie, seeing her mother held safe, finally let out a high, clear, happy laugh that broke the silence and announced the spring. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We're curious. Where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video. And if you truly enjoyed this tale, please support us by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more folks.